I've never been a big fan of parties, but there's something about New Year's Eve that always made me step outside, even if only for a few minutes, to watch the fireworks. It's as if that moment of colorful lights in the sky brought me a fleeting sense of renewal. That night, I decided to walk to the neighborhood square, where I knew I could catch the show. I left home around 11:40 p.m. The streets were deserted, the silence broken only by distant laughter and music escaping from the lit windows of houses. It was a short walk, less than 10 minutes, but something about that night felt different. The air was colder than it should have been, and the streetlights seemed dimmer, as if the entire neighborhood had fallen asleep before the big event. The first time I noticed the man was when I turned a corner. He was on the other side of the street, standing under the flickering glow of a lamppost. He wore a dark coat, the hood obscuring part of his face. At first, I didn't pay him much attention. He could have been just another neighbor heading to the square or returning from a celebration. I kept walking, but something began to bother me. Every few steps, I glanced back and saw he was still there, walking at the same pace as me. When I sped up, he sped up. When I slowed down, so did he. I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But when I stopped completely, pretending to tie my shoelace, he stopped too. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but survival instincts are hard to ignore. I decided to turn down a different street, a side path that wasn't the direct route to the square but would get me away from him. As soon as I rounded the corner, I picked up my pace, almost running, listening only to the sound of my shoes hitting the asphalt. Then I heard another sound. Footsteps. Running ***. I turned my head over my shoulder and saw him coming after me. Now there was no doubt. He was following me. The street was narrow, lined with houses that were all shut tight. There was no one I could call for help. His footsteps were heavy, hurried, echoing in the silence. My only option seemed to be running to the end of the street and trying to turn another corner, but I didn't realize it ended in a dead end. By the time I noticed, I was already trapped. I turned quickly, but he was already there. His breathing was loud, uneven, like he was anxious. His hood still covered his face, but now I could see a strange glint in his eyes. The sound of fireworks began to erupt in the sky. They briefly lit up the street, and that's when I saw him clearly. His face looked human, but something was off. His eyes seemed misaligned, and the grin he wore was far too large, stretched as if his skin was made for something bigger. I tried to scream, but the sound got stuck in my throat. He started to move closer, and all I could think about was running. But where? My back was against the wall. The sound of the fireworks grew louder, drowning out everything around me. Just as his pale hands reached for my throat, I felt the ground vanish beneath me. That New Year's Eve, while everyone on my street was celebrating, setting off fireworks and shouting countdowns, I chose to stay in my room. Listening to it all from a distance was enough for me. I was tired and just wanted a little peace before facing the new year. Around 11:30 p.m., I lay down in bed with my bedside lamp on. The fireworks outside were loud, but there was something comforting about the constant noise. I almost managed to doze off when I heard a sound coming from my bedroom door. A soft knock, 3 quick taps, like someone trying to discreetly get my attention. It struck me as odd because I was home alone. My parents had gone out to celebrate with friends, and I knew they wouldn't be back until the early hours. I got up, still trying to rationalize the noise. Maybe it was an echo from the fireworks or even the wind. I cautiously opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The house lights were off, except for a small glow coming from the living room lamp I had left on earlier. I shrugged, closed the door, and went back to bed. But before I could relax, I heard it again. This time, the knocks were louder, for taps, as if whoever was knocking was more urgent. My heart began to race. I got up, walking slowly to the door. This time, before opening it, I looked through the gap. That's when I saw him. A male figure stood in the hallway, motionless. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but the details of his face were obscured, as if the light from the living room couldn't quite reach him. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. No response. For a moment, I thought it might be a prank, maybe a drunk neighbor who had wandered into the wrong house. But the most disturbing thing was how he stood there. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. I took a deep breath, mustered some courage, and flung the door open. No one was there. The hallway was exactly as before, empty and silent, except for the distant noises from the street. I looked toward the living room, then toward the bathroom. Nothing. I shut the door again, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My instincts were screaming at me. I lay back down, keeping the lamp on, but this time I kept my eyes fixed on the door. I wanted to believe I was tired or that my mind was playing tricks on me. Then something changed. The noise from the street seemed to fade, as if it were too far away, muffled. And in the silence that followed, I heard a third knock, but it wasn't at the door. It came from the wall behind me. I jumped up, my entire body trembling. I turned to the wall, staring at it, waiting to hear it again. Nothing, just the suffocating silence. I decided to leave my room and wait out the night in the living room. When I opened the door, a shiver ran down my spine. In the middle of the hallway, there was something that hadn't been there before. Wet footprints. They started right outside my door and led toward the staircase. The house was locked. No one could have gotten in. I grabbed my phone, thinking about calling the police, but when I looked again, the footprints were gone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the living room, all the lights on, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But what scares me to this day is that, when morning came and my parents returned, I mentioned what had happened, half laughing as if it were a joke. My mom went pale. She walked over to a corner of the living room, opened an old cabinet, and pulled out a faded, worn photograph. "Are you messing with me?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. In the photo was a tall man with broad shoulders, the same silhouette I had seen that night. My mom explained that he was the house's previous owner. He had died there many years before we moved in. Apparently, no one knew why. I've never spent another New Year's Eve alone. It was a New Year's Eve party like any other. Friends, loud music, drinks, laughter, and that typical celebratory atmosphere of the holiday. I had been invited to a friend's house, an old home on the outskirts of the city. The place always had an air of mystery about it, but nothing that made me think something strange would happen that night. It was already late when it happened. I was in the middle of a conversation, trying to make myself heard over the music, when a muffled sound from upstairs caught my attention. It wasn't something simple, like a creak in the wood or the sound of the wind. It was more like something being dragged or moved irregularly. I figured it was one of my friends trying to scare someone or pull a prank, so at first, I ignored it, but the sound persisted. I climbed the stairs to see what was going on, expecting to catch a friend hiding or doing something funny. When I got to the upper floor, I realized everything was quiet. The house was full of rooms, but one of them was locked. I was about to turn back to the hallway when something made me look at the wall beside me. A black and white photograph was hanging there, in a spot I was sure I had never seen before. The frame was simple, but what shocked me was the image. It was an old photo of my friend's family, but something was wrong. I was in it, me wearing the same party clothes I had on that night. The smile on my face was identical to the others in the photo, but there was something else. In the corner, in the background, a figure stood out, a person smiling at the camera. I had never seen that person before, and their smile was strange. It was an empty smile, as if they knew something I didn't. The photo was somehow on a wall I'd never noticed before, in a spot that didn't seem to make sense. My heart raced when I noticed that behind the smiling figure, a door was partially open. It was a door I had never seen in the house before. I tried to touch the photo, but something stopped me. I felt a pressure on my chest, like the air had gotten denser there. The sound from upstairs abruptly stopped, but a chill swept over me. I started heading back down the stairs, but as I glanced at the door in the background, I realized the smiling figure in the photo was now closer to me. I tried to tell my friends, but no one seemed to care, laughing and chatting as if nothing strange had happened. I knew what I had seen, but no one believed me. The next day, when I went back to my friend's house, the photo was gone. The hallway was empty, as if it had all been just a nightmare. But the feeling that something was wrong never left me. The most terrifying part is that, as the weeks passed, I began to notice that somehow the smiling figure from the photo was always around me, as if it were watching, waiting. And worse, I have the unnerving feeling that it still is somewhere waiting for me,